Presently reading The Plague by Albert Camus. Here we have on the cover the logo of the modern library of the best books. So I picked this up from the library. It's written here, the modern library of the world's best books, The Plague. So from the inner jacket I read that it is a classic not only of the 20th century but ranks with the great novels of all times. So I could very well relate to it because just being out of this few years back we had the terrible, horrendous COVID which swept the entire world, and how people here in this place were all shut in their homes, and initially we didn't think much of it, and then the panic struck in. In the same way, the way Camus writes is you can feel, since we've gone through it, how the plague comes into it. Initially nobody really is concerned or doesn't feel that, because as a town or as a race you feel that you're going to live forever, sort of, and this is not for you, sort of. So this is in the town of Oran, a large French port on the Algerian coast. He writes a lot about Algeria. I think he likes that place. And while you read that, he writes that the easiest way of making a town's acquaintance is to ascertain how the people work in it, etc. And like Oran is grafted onto a unique landscape, he writes, in the center of a bare plateau hinged with luminous hills and a perfectly shaped bay. And then he talks about the epidemic of rats and dying rats strewn all over Oran, which is unnerving for a doctor. And actually I see the whole story from his perspective, and I found it very interesting. And he also reports, like he says, about people feeling pain in the neck, armpits and groin, which they initially thought was due to some strain of their labor. Then all this painful to the touch. The way he explains is you almost feel that you are watching a movie. And since we've just seen this kind of epidemic here, like we've gone through COVID, you almost can experience the kind of fear, the kind of helplessness, and the kind of anxiety that he has poured on into the pages. And also the perplexity of the early days that one notices or one goes through, and then gradually that gives rise to a fear which is it's like a phobia. And then he also talks about the Oran folks who had never dreamt that their place would be chosen for the scene of such grotesque happenings. Suddenly the whole town was agog with talks of rodents, a curious fever causing anxiety. And I read, everybody knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world, yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. Here have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise, he writes. So Camus writes again from the doctor's perspective, just reading. The doctor tried to recall what he had read about the disease. Figures floated across his memory, and he recalled that some 30 or so great plagues known to history had accounted for nearly 100 million deaths. But what are 100 million deaths? When one has served in a war, one hardly knows what a dead man is after a while. And since a dead man has no substance unless one has actually seen him dead, 100 million corpses broadcast throughout history are no more than a puff of smoke in the imagination. And he writes that once the town gates were shut, every one of us realized that everyone he talks about were in the same boat, and each would have to adapt himself to the new conditions of life. One can draw parallels of being locked in like this. Remember our lockdown during the COVID era. So it's exactly, you can relate with what is written. You must read the book. It's very interesting. So he writes about the townspeople's emotion that, for example, he writes, people found themselves without the least warning, hopelessly cut off, preventing from seeing one another again or even communicating with one another. Even the small satisfaction of writing letters was denied. It came to this: not only had the town ceased to be in touch with the rest of the world by normal means of communication, but also, according to a second notification, all correspondence was forbidden to avoid the risk of letters carrying infection outside the town. See how beautifully is captured the isolation, which we actually, just because we've been out of this pandemic, I can relate to this. Had I read the book a few years ago, I wouldn't have understood. I would have just marveled at what it was. But as you read, you can feel exactly he echoes the exact sentiments that we had. Like, for example, I just read that it was undoubtedly the feeling of exile, that sensation of a void within which never left us, that irrational longing to hark back to the past or else speed up the march of time, and those keen shafts of memory that stung like fire. Sometimes we toyed with our imagination, composing ourselves to wait for a ring at the bell announcing somebody's return or for the sound of a familiar footstep on the stairs. But though we might deliberately, etc. He writes as though he goes on to write that they too came to know the incorrigible sorrow of all prisoners and exiles, which is to live in company with a memory that serves no purpose, even the past of which they thought incessantly had a savour only of regret. And he also writes, hostile to the past, impatient of the present, and cheated of the future. He writes, we were much like those whom men's justice or hatred forces to live behind prison bars. Thus the only way of escaping from that intolerable leisure was to set the trains running again in one's imagination and filling the silence with the fancied tinkle of a doorbell, in practice obstinately mute. Still, it was an exile. It was, for most of us, exile in one's own home. So he also writes, during that time, any death that occurred was attributed to plague. And that's exactly what happened when the pandemic occurred. So he writes so well. He says that there were so many 302 deaths taken had taken place in the third week of plague failed to strike their imagination. For one thing, all the 302 deaths might not have been due to plague. Also, no one in the town had any idea of the average weekly death rate in ordinary times. The population of the town was about 200,000, etc. I mean, it is so close to what we noticed in those days. It's really a good book, and he also writes that when plague comes to an end, how happy they were. And he writes that he knew that these jubilant crowds did not know but could have learned from books that the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good, that it can lie dormant for years and years in furniture or on chests, that it bides its time in bedrooms, cellar, trunks, and bookshelves, and it waits for a day to recur. So just live. I mean, it's really nice. Just go through the book. It's definitely a great book. Happy reading.